Hi all, it's 10:05 on Thursday here in Yerushalayim, and in the States for Eastern Time it is 10:10 in the morning. But as I shared, the next 2 weeks I will be recording at bizarre times because we're in Israel, out and about doing things. Today we pruned lemon trees as part of the effort to help a lot of the farms in the kibbutzim in the south. So we were at Shlosha, and we just got back. So this is the Israeli post-pruning lemon tree look. We're going to discuss Parshat Lecha, and I've entitled this, Where Shall I Go and How Shall I Get There? Now, we begin here, what will evolve into the Jewish narrative as we come to Perek Yudbat 12, of Sefer Bereshit. The creator of all, the God of Bereshit, before there was anything, is now actively trying to guide a person who will become a family and then a group in the direction of becoming something better, more evolved than what humanity has shown itself to be at this point. This will be what is set in motion at this time. Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha mi'moladecha mi'beit avicha el ha'tasher echa. And God says to Avram, remember this is before his name is changed to Abraham, go for your sake, Lech Lecha, go for your own benefit. Leave your land, leave your birthplace, leave your father's house. And we've spoken in the past about how these are increasing degrees of difficulty. Go to the land that I will show you. So this is for Avram's sake. Leave all behind in preparation for a new beginning. What we have here is reboot number 3. We've already been through the first 2. We've been through creation, reboot number 1, reboot number 2. Now we're up to number 3, where we're still trying to figure out how humanity can be what God had hoped and overcoming God's disappointments. And we continue the text. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So here is another reboot with more specifics as we go along. Think about it. Adam and Chava are created. Don't eat from this tree. You may do everything else. They don't do that. Cain and Hevel go into the field. Who knows what they say? One kills the other. Noah hu hayat tzaddik b'doratav, but doesn't really concern himself with the well-being of others when God says, go build the teva. And here we have more details. I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. So there's a chosenness here. There's a mission with conditions. And what's really important for us to remember today in our lives, in our reality, as today we were with Lech, people are with Omdim B'Yachad. Everybody is trying to do different things to heal the fractures in this nation, in Israel. And of course, we have our fractures in the U.S. as well. And of course, the elephant in the room, the elections this past Tuesday. But the idea is that chosenness and mission has to be earned. And that's one of the main themes that I'm going to be following through. Soloveitchik, as I think I mentioned briefly last week, says that in order for each generation to earn the Yerusha, that is, bequeath them from previous generations, they have to add their own mark. So Noach adds to Adam v'Chava and Cain v'Hevel, the Migdal Bavel, they add to Noach, they work in unison, they're not destroying the land, Hamas, but they have purposes that are not, let's say, the most honorable. So here, Avram is being told, leave everything behind and go forth. This is going to be a new reality. Abraham goes, as God had spoken to him, and we're told Abraham was 75 years old at this time. So Abraham as I see this Parshat continue, is showing an evolved sense of understanding. He knows to take Sarai, he knows to take his wife, he takes Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had acquired, and they go to the land of Canaan. He is preparing for this new beginning that has been placed upon him through God's expectations and instructions. Rabbi Avi Killip teaches as follows regarding Avram's understanding of what was going on, explaining perhaps his readiness to do as he was told, which many commentaries address as a question or validation of his unwavering faithfulness. While this may seem simplistic when looking from the outside in, Rabbi Killip suggests that something much more profound is in play here. He teaches, Avram saw a world that was burning. A vivid midrash on this week's Torah portion, Lecha, recounts the story of how the Jewish patriarch first encountered God. Avram saw the world as a birah doleket, a flaming tower, evoking, if you remember, the kind of, is it a tikkun or is it a consequence, an onesh of the Migdal Bavel, right? A birah doleket, a flaming tower. And Avram demands indignantly, is there no one in charge? At this, God shows God's face and admits, I am the one in charge. Thus begins Abraham's relationship with the divine. Like Avram before us, we too are gazing out at a burning world. Our eyes have taken in so much devastation and horror on so many levels. In our recent reality, we have all been witness to many burning buildings, burning houses, people who have lost their lives, burning up the notion of dialogue, people who can no longer talk with each other. We too are crying out, who is in charge? We too are longing for God to show up and take some ownership of this situation. Rabbi Killip continues to teach. This midrash paints a picture of a divine relationship that emerges from a place of shock and indignation. God shows up in the world precisely because Avram demands it. The world without God's presence is untenable. It will burn itself out. Avram won't let that happen. Avram is holding God accountable, reminding God that the ruler of the universe needs to act like it. I don't know about you, but my social media has been burning up with all kinds of memes and pain and burning souls and all of that. And in one of them, there are various iterations of Bibi is not controlling the world. Trump is not controlling the world. Nobody's controlling the world. Biden isn't. Harris isn't. It's God. Shlita, God, who controls the world. And any human that puts themselves in that place and doesn't have anava and doesn't have humility does not understand what their mission is. Avram understands that the world needs God. And so he devotes the rest of his life to being an agent of God's blessing, to have God's blessing for the people and to protect them from those who would hurt them flow through him. Rather than blame God for the fire or step aside and let God put it out, Avram works on God's behalf. And it is in this way that we are taught we are to see his actions. When he advocates, when he yields to God's faith, having some understanding where other people may not. And again, and I'm going to read a little passage from it in a few weeks. For those of you that know Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, we see this in that work, which was written while Steven Spielberg was dealing with his own faith issues and figuring out God's place in his life. The medieval sage Rashi allows us to listen in, explaining that God is essentially telling Avram, blessings are being entrusted to you. From now on, you will bless whomever you wish. Avraham here becomes the bestower of divine blessings and spreads these blessings throughout the world as his assigned mission. But again, through the proper intentions, through completed deeds as indicated by God, not for his own sake, but for something much bigger, much grander. And the one healing piece of the last couple of days for me, both being in Israel and seeing how everybody comes together and how everybody is working together, and yes, there are conflicts for sure, but to hear how people are not, as somebody said, I believe it was Kamala Harris, not throwing up their hands, but rolling up their sleeves. We're still working on this, and we are not giving up in making this a better place, a better world for all. All of this begins with listening and trusting God, which is what Avram does in this particular reboot. While the previous quoted commentary comes from Chabad sources, I now want to share a reading and an explanation from a member of the World Union of Progressive Judaism. Rabbi Mark Borovitz, in his book, Finding Yourself and Recovery in Torah, suggests that these opening verses denote God's greatest gift to us. After the failure of both Adam and Noah to achieve the unachievable of perfection in the first 11 chapters of the Torah, Avram is told that he can become a blessing because he is going to live in the world as his essential, imperfect self. In other words, this is the continuation of the journey that I began 2 weeks ago with Parshat Bereshit, of God and the human being coming to a better and more realistic and more workable understanding of self and of each other. We will have disappointments, we will have setbacks, we will have needs for reboots, but that's the nature of being human. Rabbi Borovitz continues to teach. Avram, Lech, Lecha, is being told to leave the places of negativity that pull him down. And he is leaving his father's house so that he can be his own person and not have to live out someone else's script. There is no greater blessing from God than this. When I come to Israel, there are people that I try to get in touch with everybody. I'm sorry for those that we couldn't meet up. But last night we had our cousins' dinner that we often have. And we were all talking about our children and catching up and what everybody's doing. And we were talking about, well, my children are doing X, Y, and Z. And they're living their own lives. And that's what we want for our children to do as they get older. We recently had the Chag of Sukkot, and I often say, my family we don't spend Sukkot together. Sukkot, we don't. Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, and the Shabbat afterwards, because those of us in America, it was a 3-day Yom folks. We did that together. But Sukkot, we don't. Why? Because my incredible daughters, along with their wives, and one of the couples has a beautiful little baby, they build their own big sukkah outside of their backyard, outside of their house, and they invite everybody in Watertown, Massachusetts, to their sukkah. My oldest daughter and her husband and 4 children built their great sukkah in Center City, Philadelphia, and invite everybody there. We, my husband and I, still use the sukkah that we've had for many years, and we invite everybody to ours as well. So while we are all making Sukkot for so many other people, we do not end up spending that Chag together. But that is each person living their own script and doing it in their own way. And that is the greatest blessing from God. Rabbi Borovitz continues to teach. The inclusion of the second half of Bereshit Yud Bet has always fascinated me. Why did our ancestors include this story where Abraham's faith is tested as he descends into Mitzrayim? Egypt, the etymological meaning of being a narrow place. If video cameras or 24-hour news cycles had existed 3,800 years ago, imagine the headlines. Why does our tradition recount this story? Traditional commentators have sought for millennia to find excuses for Avraham's behavior. I would suggest that this folk tale of moral descent that accompanied Avram's lack of faith in God, that God would bless him and get him through this challenge, is a case study in the fact that as we move through the generations and we add to our Yerusha and we try to do better, we are still imperfect. Avraham is not a perfect person. And instead of traditional commentators that want to find excuses and will do a sort of kind of intellectual acrobatics to do so, maybe instead it's more reasonable, as Nechama Leibowitz taught, Aleha Shalom, to look at the reality and work within the reality and learn the lessons that reality comes to teach us, instead of reducing everything to these kind of fairy tale kinds of narratives. There are, to be sure, many other voices chiming in on the significance of this parsha and its framing of the story to come. What I find most noteworthy here is that it's one of the few places where there seems to be agreement across the denominational divide that something special is going on here. We do take note of one important element of the departure here, namely the last sentence of the second quote. Yes, we are imperfect. Avram is caught in several challenging situations here and does not always know how to respond to people who threaten him. Yet, this same imperfect person negotiates and shows some advancing on his own personal learning curve of what to do when imperfect humans interact with each other, giving, for example, the first choice for land to his kinsman, Lot, to avoid conflict. Progress, as we see in chapter 13. Vayomer Avram el Lot, el na tihi mimriva alna nimetzed. And Avram says to Lot, let's not make a quarrel between us. Beini uveinecha, between myself and between you. Uvein ro'ai, uvein ro'echa, and between my shepherds and yours. Ki anashim anachnu achim. We are brothers. We are connected. We need to share this narrative. Obviously, there are many lessons for us here today in Israel, to be sure. He then says, Halo kol haaretz lefanecha, isn't all the land before you? Go. If you go left, I will go right. If you go right, I will go left. Let's both have land. What a concept. And Lot raises his eyes and sees the entire plain of Jordan, that it was entirely watered before God had destroyed Sodom and Amorah, and that's what he chooses. So Lot goes to the east, and they part from one another. Avram dwells in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwells in the cities of the plain, and he pitches his tents close to Sodom. And we then read, V'anshei Sodom ra'im v'chata'im ad Hashem ma'od. And the people of Sodom were bad, and they were sinful against God. So why is this statement here? And this is what I'm always looking for. I'm, as you know, an Aviva Zornberg fan. Let's look behind and underneath the words and figure it out. What did Avram see that Lot did not? How had his experiences earlier regarding Sarah and Pharaoh taught him to see these characteristics, whereas they may have eluded Lot? One of the things that we do when we over-osterize and analyze what's going on and what went wrong here and who did what and what have you, is we have to remember it's like the three blind men with the elephant. We all have different perspectives. So given the experience of this person, they may have a better understanding of one dynamic, but not the understanding that this person has of that dynamic. And somehow we have to put it all together. God says to Avram after Lot goes his way, raise your eyes, look northward, southward, eastward, westward, and notice there is a second set of instructions here involving departure. And the urgency is not as present. It's not Lech, Lecha, go for yourself, but it's Sana, please raise your eyes. In other words, there seems to be more of an interactive dialogue here, as opposed to instructions coming from God. And this notion of Avram and God understanding each other, God understanding Avram's weaknesses, Avram perhaps understanding that God has a different perspective, which may be part of the story, by the way, when we get to Yitzchak and the Akedah. This is them coming to terms with how they're going to have to interact. God then says, for all the land that you see, I will give it to you, U'lezaracha ad olam. Now, I want to say one thing. About the land. We in the U.S., we in the Western world, don't understand the connection to the land that people have here. It was very interesting. At one point during our visit today to Enash Lecha, this lovely, lovely man, Tomer, who was explaining a lot of things to us, was telling us how he had to keep tilling the soil and keep the fields active. He said, because otherwise there are Bedouins in the area, and they feel that all the land is potentially theirs. They would come, set up their tents, and then you couldn't have them leave. So he says we have to continue to till the soil to indicate that we are taking care of it and is not no man's land. Land is very important in this part of the world. And I think a lot of Americans, when they are looking at what's going on, there's politics, there's Hamas, there's all these other factors, but they don't always understand elements of what I'm going to call the Arabic culture, which is what it is, even though people get very upset with me when I say that, but that is this part of the world. I'm not using it as an ethnic identifier of a group of people to the exclusion of others. But the notion that there is that connection to the land is critical. Keep in mind, the connection to the land here is thousands of years old. There's no way that folks in the U.S. understand that. The people who understand that are First Americans or Native Americans, depending on where you are. And that's a whole other set of problems. Further, when it says, I will give this land to you, it does not mean to the exclusion of others. Think about this. The land that we're talking about here, we've never occupied, frankly. I mean, we're not in Iraq. We're not in a lot of these places that are part of Avram's journey. We are in this land, and there are other people in this land too. And how do we acknowledge and work together? And there are people who are doing that beautifully. However, unfortunately, governmental forces are working against it, just like we have in the U.S. around other issues. God continues, I will make your seed like the dust of the earth, so that nobody will be able to count the dust of the earth. Rise, walk its breadth and its length, and I will give it to you. So we see a familiarity here between Hashem and Avram. This familiarity is developing, and thus the tone of the conversation and the instructions given are changing. We simultaneously note that Avram is taking on a different code of behavior not seen previously. And I'll point to 3 elements. 1, avoiding conflict that could end badly, as we saw with Cain and Hevel and the multitudes of populations before. He says to Lot, here's the land. If you go this way, I will go that way. If you go that way, I will go this way. 2, there's a recognizing of differences and separating groups who cannot work and live together. I don't want there to be quarrels between my shepherds and your shepherds. So let's agree that we'll each have our place. And 3, living within the framework of the limitations of the human being, sharing this realization with God, whom Avram has elected to follow. In recognizing these realities and pivoting appropriately to accommodate them, Avram is showing an understanding of God and bringing that understanding into the world, albeit as the imperfect human he is. This, I would submit, is among his most important contributions and achievements. As his challenges and journey into the uncertainty of the future continues, Avram now presents God with his current angst as follows in Perek Tetvav, in chapter 15. And Avram says, "You haven't given me a child. Here you've promised me all this land, you've promised me this great future, and I have no child. One of my household will inherit me." And God comes to him and says, "No." God takes Avram outside, and God says, "Please," again, habet na, like sana. See? God's showing us manners, right? "Please look, Hashemayma, to the heavens and count the stars. If you are able to count them, so will be your seed." And Avram believed in God. V'yachshaveh lo tzedakah. And God accounts this to him as righteousness. Ish tzaddik. While many of our traditional teachers too often feel a need to sidestep the reality of what it means to be human and flawed, it appears to me that in doing so, the relationship that develops between Avram and God would be minimized. In other words, if we don't accept the reality, but we make it fanciful, we make it like a fairy tale, then it's like once upon a time and they live happily ever after. And that's not the way it goes. We often wonder what is so special about Avram, about Moshe, about all who are chosen by God, including the collective known as Bnei Israel. What is special is not that we are perfect, for we are not. The special nature of these relationships is the faith, the missteps, the coming back together, the reboots, and the many elements of the trajectory of the real nature of the human being and God's understanding of that. God needs to accommodate these factors in these narratives, and in doing so facilitates their continuity. The sidesteps, the seeming detours, amplify the strength of these relationships, and they cannot be extrapolated from their narratives. Thus, as we try to come to an understanding of that which may not initially appear to be fathomable, we note different approaches, both among those in the narrative and those of us looking in from the outside for important lessons and explanations of why things are the way they are. This is about living with the notion that multiple truths and approaches do not take away from the significance of the narrative. Multiple directions and multiple claims and multiple trajectories and multiple senses of purpose do not negate nor necessarily exclude each other. And this is what we as human beings have to learn to accept. As I always say, we need to learn to play on the same playground together, either in our small separate groups, or let there be a kind of ebb and flow between the groups, or however it works. Because if we don't learn how to share that space, we will not have a space. And for those of us who think that we are in some kind of existential crisis, consider that. Justification of actions of imperfect humans does not add to the nature of our understanding of Torah. I'm going to repeat that. Justifications of actions of imperfect humans do not add to the nature of our understanding of Torah, that actually detract from it. To believe that this is part of Torah min hashamayim is precisely what sets this text apart from, say, Greek mythology or Roman stories of the gods or other such folkloristic traditions or belief systems. Our story is indeed about imperfect and real human beings and God coming to terms with each other and crafting their joint story. Regarding this approach, Professor Tamar Ross, with whom I've had the honor and the privilege of learning through the years, explains as follows. The initial problem I seek to resolve in my teaching is how to defend the traditional Jewish belief in Torah min hashamayim when faced with evidence that appears to contradict it. Beyond the usual difficulties, such as challenges to the notion of divine authorship on grounds of erroneous content, questionable morality, and a complicated literary genesis which testifies to evolutionary historical development, I am especially troubled by the very notion of divine revelation as verbal communication. Given that language is a distinctly human activity, inevitably rooted in a particular perspective and a cultural bias. My solution is to regard belief in revelation as an as-if statement, a useful fiction, or in Maimonides terminology, a necessary truth, whose purpose is to represent and engender certain attitudes rather than to describe an objective occurrence. I see this understanding as closely related to views of religion as commitment to a range of doctrines and norms which serve as a cultural linguistic filter constructing the way we view the world, rather than an objective account of reality, metaphysical or otherwise. By taking this approach that is suggested by Professor Ross, we can all see ourselves in our own lives as part of this story. We can look at our own reality and its challenges at this difficult moment in time for so many of us, for so many reasons. And we can try to understand what can we learn from Avram saying to Lot, we will share the land. We will share the land in a way that our shepherds will not argue. You go one way, I will go the other. There's enough for all of us. How do we learn from Avram's imperfect responses to difficult situations, such as that confronts him when he meets Paro and he sort of, pulls the rug out under from Sarah, his wife? How do we look at Avram in terms of having his own doubts and questioning his faith in God and accepting that as part of the story? Questioning God does not mean you don't believe in God. I would suggest that questioning God, even being angry at God, I think God can accept all of that. I think God knows we are really trying to figure it out by acting in an appropriate emotional, psychological manner as the imperfect human beings we are. Think about it. What good is a love relationship if you don't know how to go through the obstacle of the challenges that are inherently part of that relationship? By taking this approach and looking critically, and it's interesting, I've mentioned a group of people, but three commentators, my favorite teachers, Tamar Ross, Nechama Leibowitz, Aviva Zornberg. I will include Devorah Steinmetz in that, Judy Klitzner, a bunch of others, that we all look at the text. And we do, as Aviva Zornberg says, go behind and underneath the words. To suggest that we totally understand God, to me, is the height of hubris. It's anava, it's humility. It's understanding that we don't understand that is going to help us build that relationship. By taking this approach, I hope that we can all see ourselves in our own lives as part of this story and learn lessons when we come to these roadblocks in our own lives. This is the ongoing constant of the Jewish narrative. Humans are always humans, and God is God. And somehow, we are still trying to figure out how to relate to that reality and craft our joint narrative. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. I wish healing to all those who need healing, and with continued prayers for repair of the fissures, of the fractures that so mar our world. Next week again, I will still be in Israel, so who knows when I'll record, but it will be on Facebook, and you can check out my YouTube channel. Be well all. Lecha.